Marcus Hill had lived many different lives in his 45 years, but none brought him the peace he found on his farm. Long before the rows of corn stretched across the soil, before the chickens clucked around the wooden barn, Marcus had been a Navy SEAL. He had traveled to faraway countries, faced dangers most people could never imagine, and carried the weight of responsibility for his brothers in uniform. When he retired, he did not seek glory or recognition. All he wanted was quiet. The farmland had been in his family for generations. His grandfather had plowed these same fields with his own hands, and his father had dreamed of expanding it, though life never gave him the chance. When Marcus returned home after his service, the land had been waiting, overgrown and forgotten, but still alive. To him, restoring it felt like restoring his own soul. Each morning he rose before the sun, lacing up boots not for combat but for soil. He stepped outside to the smell of fresh earth and dew resting on the grass, a far cry from the dust and smoke of battlefields. The neighbors saw him as a quiet man. He wasn't one for long conversations, though he always offered a smile and a polite nod when someone passed by. If an elderly neighbor needed help fixing a fence or carrying heavy feed bags, Marcus was the first to lend a hand. Children in the community often waved to him when they rode their bikes past his farm, and he waved back, amused at how carefree their lives seemed. Few knew his past, and Marcus preferred it that way. To them, he was just a farmer, and he was content with that. Life on the farm was not easy, but Marcus embraced the challenges. The long days under the hot sun, the calloused hands, the constant work of planting, watering, and harvesting, all of it gave him purpose. He took pride in watching small seeds grow into strong plants, just as he had once taken pride in seeing young recruits grow into capable soldiers. At night, he often sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea listening to the crickets sing. It was in those moments of stillness that he felt most alive, far more than he ever had in the chaos of war. There were times when memories returned, flashes of noise, images of comrades, both victories and losses, but Marcus had learned how to let them pass. The farm grounded him, reminding him that life was still beautiful, still worth working for. Unlike the world of combat, where destruction was often the outcome, farming was about creation, about nurturing life from the soil. That difference mattered deeply to him. In town, Marcus was known as reliable, steady, and disciplined. At the local supply store, the owner often remarked on how Marcus never wasted a word, but always showed respect. At the small diner, where locals gathered for breakfast, he would sit in the corner with his plate of eggs and bacon, listening more than speaking. People were curious about him, wondering why a man his age chose such solitude, but no one pressed too hard. They respected his privacy. Though he rarely spoke about his past, there were moments when it quietly revealed itself. One summer afternoon, a heavy storm rolled in quickly, the kind that often floods the fields and tears through fences. When a neighbor's barn roof began to collapse under the weight of the rain, Marcus was already there, tying ropes and guiding people with calm, clear instructions. His voice carried authority, not harsh but commanding, and everyone instinctively followed. Later, when the storm passed, the neighbor thanked him, remarking that Marcus seemed to know exactly what to do in such chaos. Marcus only smiled and said, "I've been through worse." In truth, Marcus had no desire to be seen as a hero. He had already lived that life, and it came with too many scars, both visible and hidden. He wanted to be remembered simply as a man who worked his land and minded his business. For him, peace was not silence, but the freedom to live without fear. As the seasons changed, the farm blossomed under his care. Rows of vegetables grew tall, animals thrived, and the farmhouse became a place of comfort. The townsfolk began to rely on Marcus's produce, appreciating not just its quality but also the honesty behind it. He never overcharged, never cut corners, and always delivered what he promised. His reputation for integrity spread quietly, and though Marcus never sought attention, it gave him a sense of belonging. At night, when the sky was clear and stars stretched endlessly above, Marcus often thought about his old teammates. He remembered the laughter they shared in the toughest conditions, the trust that had kept them alive, and the sacrifices made along the way. He wondered where they were now, scattered across the country, some finding peace like him, others still searching. He missed them, but he also knew that life had moved them all in different directions. Despite the calm, Marcus carried an unshakable discipline. Every morning, before he began work on the farm, he maintained a routine, running, push-ups, and stretches that kept his body strong. He had promised himself that he would never let his skills completely fade, not because he expected trouble, but because he knew life was unpredictable. The farm gave him peace, but peace could be fragile. Still, Marcus did not dwell on fear. His heart belonged to the soil, the animals, and the rhythm of farming life. He often spoke gently to his crops as he worked, believing that kindness extended even to plants. When the harvest came, he felt a sense of victory, one earned through patience rather than force. The locals admired his work ethic. At county fairs, Marcus sometimes donated baskets of vegetables to be sold for community funds, though he rarely stayed long enough to receive praise. He slipped away quietly, preferring to let others take the spotlight. Humility was part of who he was. Marcus Hill's life seemed steady, unshakable, and deeply ordinary to anyone looking from the outside. But beneath the calm surface was a man who had walked through storms most people would never face. He had chosen peace, chosen the farm, and chosen a life where the loudest sound at night was the wind moving gently through the cornfields. He believed this life would carry him through the rest of his days, simple and undisturbed. What Marcus did not know, as he worked under the rising sun and tended his land, was that shadows were beginning to stretch toward his quiet world. Trouble was coming, the kind he had hoped to leave behind forever. And when it arrived, it would test everything he had built, everything he believed, and everything he had fought to protect. The peace that Marcus Hill worked so hard to build began to show cracks one summer when whispers of trouble started moving through town. At first, it was only small stories. A neighbor mentioned that tools had gone missing from a shed. Another said someone had stolen fuel from their tractor. These things happened from time to time, but there was something different about the way it spread. It wasn't just one farmer or one household. It was many, and it was happening too often to be ignored. Marcus listened quietly when he stopped at the feed store or the diner, hearing the same unease in every voice. People talked about a group of newcomers who had arrived in the county a few months back. They didn't seem interested in honest work. Instead, they hung around the edges of town, appearing late at night and disappearing just as quickly. Nobody knew exactly who they were, but their presence had unsettled the small community. For Marcus, the farm was his world. He tried to keep his focus on his crops and animals, refusing to let rumors disturb his routine. Still, he paid attention. His years as a Navy SEAL had trained him to notice patterns, and this situation had the signs of something growing more serious. He could see the nervous looks in the eyes of the older farmers and the way families locked their doors earlier in the evening. The small town had always felt safe, but now an invisible cloud of worry hung in the air. One late afternoon, Marcus was mending a fence on the edge of his property when he heard the sound of engines in the distance. 2 trucks rolled down the dirt road, kicking up dust as they approached. The vehicles slowed near his fields, and a handful of young men leaned out the windows, shouting and laughing loudly. Marcus straightened, watching them carefully. They weren't from around here. He could tell by their unfamiliar faces and the careless way they carried themselves. The trucks didn't stop, but the men shouted something about his farm being a nice place before speeding off again. Marcus kept his calm, though his instincts stirred. He didn't like the way they had looked at his land as if it was something they could take. He finished his work, but a sense of unease stayed with him. Over the next week, similar encounters followed. Sometimes he would notice fresh tire tracks on the dirt road that hadn't been there before. Sometimes at night his dogs would bark furiously at shadows near the edge of the property. Marcus began to sense that these men weren't just passing through. They were circling, testing, waiting. The turning point came one quiet evening when Marcus was stacking hay in the barn. The sun had dipped low and the sky glowed orange. As he stepped outside, he caught sight of 3 men near his fence line. They weren't neighbors. Their clothes were rough, their voices loud, and they were climbing over the fence as if it belonged to them. Marcus walked toward them calmly, his steps steady. He didn't rush, but his presence was commanding enough that the men noticed him immediately. "This is private property," Marcus said in a firm, even tone. "You need to head back the way you came." The men laughed, glancing at each other as if they had found his words amusing. One of them shrugged and said, "Relax, old man. We're just looking around." Marcus kept his gaze steady. Looking around someone else's land isn't a good habit. "Move along." For a moment, silence hung in the air. The men exchanged glances again, but this time their laughter faded. There was something in Marcus's voice, something calm but sharp, that made them hesitate. Finally, they stepped back, muttering under their breath, and left the way they had come. Marcus stood there until they were gone, his jaw tight. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened them, but he could tell by the way they looked at him before leaving that this wouldn't be the last time. They had seen him alone, and in their eyes he was just a farmer, nothing more. The next few days confirmed his suspicions. Strange things started happening on his farm. A water trough was tipped over in the night. Several rows of young plants were trampled as though someone had walked straight through them. A small shed had its lock broken, though nothing inside was worth much. Marcus fixed each problem without complaint, but his sharp mind understood what was happening. They were sending a message. One evening, Marcus drove into town to pick up supplies. At the diner, he overheard a group of locals talking nervously. The same men had been spotted near other farms, sometimes stealing tools, sometimes just making their presence known. Families were uneasy, but no one wanted direct conflict. This was a small community, and most people weren't used to standing against groups like that. As Marcus paid for his meal, the diner owner leaned over and said quietly, "Be careful, Marcus. Word is they've been talking about your place. You've got more land than most, and that makes you a target." Marcus nodded, not showing fear but noting the warning. He thanked the man, left the diner, and drove home in thoughtful silence. He had chosen this life for peace, not conflict. Yet peace was fragile, and now it seemed that trouble had found him whether he wanted it or not. That night he sat on his porch, listening to the frogs in the distance. His dogs rested near his feet, calm for the moment. Marcus thought about what he had seen, what he had felt. These men were not just passing troublemakers. They had a plan, even if it was only to take what they wanted without consequence. He knew their type well enough. He had seen men like that in other parts of the world, reckless and careless until someone stood firm against them. But Marcus also knew he had to be careful. This was not the battlefield, and this was not war. This was his home, his community. He didn't want violence, and he didn't want fear to spread further than it already had. For now he would remain steady, watchful, and prepared. The days stretched on, each one adding to the tension. Marcus worked his fields as usual, but his senses were sharper, his eyes scanning the tree lines more often. He kept his tools in order, his animals secure, and his mind clear. His years of training told him that something was coming. He didn't know when, but he knew it would happen. For the rest of the town, the unease was a shadow that lingered. Parents called their children inside earlier than before. Farmers double-checked their locks. The sheriff did what he could, but with such a small force, there was only so much he could cover. Everyone was waiting, hoping the trouble would pass, but Marcus knew better. As the sun set one evening, painting the sky in deep shades of purple, Marcus stood on his porch and looked over his land. It was quiet now, the kind of quiet he cherished. Yet he could feel it, the weight of eyes watching, the test of patience building. Trouble had arrived, and sooner or later it would come knocking directly at his door. The trouble Marcus had been expecting finally arrived on a cool autumn night. The air was sharp, and the sky was filled with heavy clouds that hid the stars. Marcus had finished his day as usual, feeding the animals and checking the fences before settling down on his porch with a lantern glowing faintly beside him. He enjoyed the silence of the evening, but even in those still moments, His instincts kept him alert. He had felt it for days, the sense that something was moving closer, that patience was wearing thin for the group of men who had been circling his land. The dogs were the first to notice. They stirred suddenly, ears sharp, growls low and uneasy. Marcus put down his cup of tea and leaned forward. In the distance, he heard faint laughter carried by the wind, followed by the crunch of tires rolling over gravel. He rose slowly, his tall frame calm, steady, and unshaken. He didn't need to see them to know who it was. The gang had chosen this night. Moments later, 2 trucks appeared at the edge of the property, their headlights sweeping across the field like giant searchlights. The engines rumbled loudly, breaking the calm of the countryside. The trucks stopped, near the gate, and several figures jumped down, their shadows stretching long in the glow of the lamps. They moved without hesitation, climbing over the fence as though it were their own. Marcus stepped down from the porch and walked toward the barn. He didn't move quickly or nervously. Every step was measured, his posture strong but non-threatening. He didn't want to fight. He wanted them to leave just as he had told them before. Yet he knew from the determined way they marched across the dirt that this time they hadn't come to talk. As they spread out across his yard, Marcus could see their eyes on him, testing him, challenging him. One of them kicked over a bucket. Another tossed a broken branch against the barn door, their laughter echoing in the night. "This is your place, huh?" one of them called out. "Big farm for one man." Marcus stood tall, his voice calm, but clear. "You've been warned before. This land isn't yours. You need to turn back now." The men exchanged glances, smirking. They weren't expecting fear in his voice, but they were determined to show their power. They stepped closer, scattering across the yard as if to surround him. One of them dragged his hand across the fence. Another moved toward the chicken coop. The animals stirred nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Marcus did not raise his voice, but the strength in his tone carried across the night. "Leave. You don't want to do this." But his words only brought more laughter. One man kicked at the fence post, breaking it loose. Another pulled at the barn door, rattling it hard. The sight made Marcus's jaw tighten. He had lived through far worse moments in far more dangerous places. But this was his home. Watching strangers treat it with such disrespect cut deep into him. As they pressed closer, Marcus's training surfaced. His mind sharpened, his senses heightened. He didn't panic. Instead, he calculated. Every step they took, every careless move, he noted. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever by himself, not with their numbers. Still, he stood his ground. He moved with quiet precision, shifting his stance, watching every angle. One of the men stepped too close, trying to shove Marcus backward, but Marcus didn't stumble. His calm, steady frame didn't yield. His eyes locked on the man's, and for a moment the younger man froze. There was something about Marcus's stare, something unshakable that carried weight. Still, the group pushed forward, their confidence fed by their numbers. The barn door finally cracked under the pressure of another shove, and Marcus felt the weight of the situation pressing down. He could defend himself, yes. He could hold his own for a time. But there were too many of them, and this was no battlefield with fellow soldiers at his side. This was his farm, and he was alone. A sharp ache ran through his ribs when one of the men pushed him hard against the porch railing. The impact stung, but Marcus didn't cry out. Instead, he steadied himself, his breathing slow and controlled. His body was trained to endure, but even he knew he couldn't hold out forever. The men cheered loudly, stomping through his yard as though celebrating their control. But Marcus's mind was already moving beyond the moment. He had faced tougher odds in his past, but the difference was that back then, he had his brothers beside him, men he trusted with his life. Here, he stood alone. And then, like a spark in his mind, he remembered something that gave him strength. He wasn't truly alone. His team might be scattered across the country, each living their own life now, but bonds like theirs never broke. They had made promises to each other long ago, promises that went beyond the battlefield. They had said that if one of them ever needed help, all it would take was a call. The thought steadied Marcus even more. He looked at the group tearing through his farm, their laughter filling the night, and though his body ached from the blows he had endured, his spirit did not falter. He knew exactly what he needed to do. As the men grew bolder, Marcus pulled himself back toward the porch. He didn't speak much more to them. He didn't waste his breath. Instead, he waited for the right moment when their attention shifted elsewhere and he stepped inside his house. His movements were deliberate, controlled, as though he were simply retrieving something ordinary. But what he reached for was not a weapon. It was his phone. With steady hands, Marcus scrolled through the numbers he rarely used but had never forgotten. Each name on that list carried years of loyalty, sacrifice, and trust. These were not ordinary friends. They were brothers, forged in fire. He selected one and pressed call. When the familiar voice answered on the other end, Marcus spoke with quiet strength. "It's me. I need you." There was no hesitation in the reply. "Say no more. Where are you?" Marcus gave the details quickly, his words steady even as the noise of the men echoed outside. The answer from his old comrade was short but certain. "Hold on, we're coming." Marcus ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. A calm washed over him, not because the trouble outside had ended, but because he knew what was coming. He knew that the men who had chosen his farm had no idea what kind of storm they had walked into. Outside, the gang continued their noise, unaware that the ground beneath them had just shifted. Marcus stepped back onto the porch, his silhouette framed by the faint lantern light. His eyes carried the same unshakable strength they always had, but now there was something else, a quiet certainty. He had made the call. The balance was about to change. The night after Marcus made the call felt longer than most. He didn't sleep much, not because of fear, but because his mind was sharp and focused. He had faced storms before, and this one was no different. It was just waiting to break. His ribs ached from the shove against the railing, and his farm still bore the marks of the intruder's recklessness. Yet Marcus sat calmly on his porch, lantern glowing softly, his dogs resting uneasily at his feet. He knew help was on its way. By morning, the farm looked the same to anyone passing by. Rows of crops, a barn, a simple wooden house. But Marcus knew things were different now. The call he had made was not a small one. It was a signal, a reaching hand back to a bond forged in places far harsher than this quiet countryside. He didn't know exactly how soon his old teammates would arrive, but he trusted them. Trust was something they had all built in fire, in silence, in danger. 3 days later, as the sun rose over the fields, Marcus heard the sound of an engine on the dirt road. Not the rumble of the loud trucks he had grown used to from the troublemakers, but a steady, controlled sound. A dark SUV rolled up slowly, dust rising behind it. When it stopped near the gate, the door opened, and out stepped a familiar figure. It was David Ross, a man Marcus had known for more than 20 years. Taller now, with silver in his beard, but with the same sharp eyes that once scanned foreign landscapes for threats. Behind him came two more, Luis Ortega, quiet but strong, and Sam Keller, broad-shouldered and smiling faintly, as though glad to be back beside his brothers. For a moment, words didn't come easily. They simply stood there, taking in the years that had passed since their last mission together. Then David stepped forward and gripped Marcus's shoulder firmly. "You call, we come," he said simply. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of loyalty in those few words. They didn't waste time. Over coffee at Marcus's kitchen table, the men listened as he explained what had been happening: the trucks, the trespassing, the threats, the damage. His voice stayed steady, factual, but his teammates read between the lines. They knew Marcus wasn't a man who asked for help lightly. If he had reached out, the situation was serious. Sam leaned back, his arms crossed. "Sounds like they think you're just another farmer. They don't know who they're dealing with." Marcus gave a small smile. "And I'd like to keep it that way if possible. No fights, no chaos. I just want my land respected, my home safe." David nodded. "Then we handle this the smart way. We watch, we prepare, and we make sure they understand without things getting out of hand. From that moment, the farm transformed. It wasn't obvious to outsiders, but subtle changes took place. Luis walked the perimeter, noting weak spots in the fencing. Sam reinforced the barn doors, making them sturdier. David mapped out sight lines from the porch and fields, the way he used to map terrain during missions. Marcus moved with them, his farm becoming not a battlefield but a place strengthened by quiet readiness. At night, they stayed watchful, each man taking turns walking the property while the others rested. The dogs seemed calmer with the extra company, sensing the strength and steadiness of Marcus's old squad. During the day, they blended into farm work, hauling feed, tending crops, repairing fences. To a passerby, it looked like nothing more than friends helping out. But beneath that calm surface, every man's eyes stayed alert, every sense tuned to the possibility of trouble. The gang didn't stay quiet for long. A week after Marcus's call, the trucks returned. This time, they arrived in the evening, loud as ever, lights flashing across the fields. But as they neared the gate, something was different. Instead of finding Marcus alone, they saw figures moving around the yard. Calm, steady men who carried themselves with quiet authority. The intruders slowed, confused. They weren't expecting Marcus to have company, and certainly not men who stood with such silent confidence. From a distance, it wasn't clear who these men were, but something about their posture unsettled the newcomers. They lingered for a moment, engines idling, before finally turning back down the road. Marcus and his teammates watched from the porch, no words spoken. They didn't celebrate, didn't boast. They simply noted the reaction and prepared for the next time. The next few days brought more tests. Sometimes the trucks would pass slowly at night, their headlights sweeping across the farm. Sometimes shadows lingered at the edge of the fields, watching but not daring to enter. Each time, the veterans stayed calm, their presence alone enough to shift the balance. One evening, as the sky darkened, the gang tried again, this time walking toward the barn with bold voices. But they were met by David and Sam, who stepped into view before they reached the door. Neither man raised his voice. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was like a wall, unmovable, steady, commanding respect. "You're on private land," David said firmly. "Turn around and leave." The men hesitated, something in the tone stopping them. They had expected an easy target, a man they could push around. Instead, they found a group of strangers whose eyes carried a weight they didn't understand. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, muttering under their breath, the intruders backed away, retreating into the night. Inside the farmhouse later, Marcus's friends discussed what they had seen. Luis, who had been quiet most of the day, finally spoke. "They're testing boundaries, seeing how far they can go, but they won't push much further. They can already sense something they don't want to find out." Marcus nodded. He knew Luis was right. People like that fed on fear. But when fear was absent, when calm strength stood in its place, they lost confidence. Still, the veterans didn't lower their guard. They remained watchful, blending daily life with quiet preparation. They weren't there to intimidate, only to protect. And slowly, the pattern began to shift. The gang appeared less often, their boldness fading. Word spread quietly in town that Marcus wasn't alone, that his friends were staying on the farm. Nobody knew exactly who they were, but whispers grew. Something about the way they stood, the way they moved, suggested discipline beyond ordinary men. The community felt safer knowing Marcus was not facing trouble alone. Neighbors who had been nervous before now carried themselves with a little more confidence, inspired by the quiet presence of Marcus and his squad. Even children noticed, riding their bikes past the farm and waving with more cheer than before. For Marcus, the feeling of having his old brothers beside him was both comforting and powerful. It reminded him of days when trust was absolute, when each man's strength was multiplied by the loyalty of those around him. And though years had passed since their last mission together, he saw now that nothing had changed between them. One night, as they sat on the porch with the lantern glowing and the field stretching quietly beyond, Sam turned to Marcus with a smile. "Feels like old times, doesn't it?" Marcus nodded. "It does. But this time, We're protecting something different, something that matters in a whole new way. David raised his glass of iced tea. To peace, he said simply. To peace, the others echoed. And in that moment, Marcus knew the balance had shifted for good. The gang might not fully understand who they had tried to intimidate, but they now knew enough. This farm, this man, and his quiet strength backed by his brothers, none of it was to be taken lightly. The trouble that had once shadowed the land was beginning to lose its power. The days that followed carried a different kind of peace across Marcus's farm. It was not the fragile quiet that came before the storm, nor the tense silence of waiting for trouble. This peace felt steady, like soil finally settling after heavy rain. The gang that had once circled his land now appeared less and less, their trucks no longer rumbling down his road at night. Word had spread, though no one knew exactly how. Some said the strangers had finally realized Marcus was not the kind of man they thought he was. Others whispered that the men who had come to stay on his farm weren't ordinary friends, but carried the kind of presence that only comes from lives spent in service and discipline. Whatever the truth, the result was clear. The trouble was fading. Marcus continued his work as he always had. He woke with the sun, fed the animals, checked the fences, and moved through his land with quiet purpose. But now, there was something different in the air. Neighbors who used to speak with nervous tones carried themselves with more confidence. Families who once locked their doors earlier than usual now lingered on their porches in the evening, enjoying the sunset again. Children rode their bikes past the farm, waving cheerfully at Marcus and his friends, their laughter ringing freely across the fields. David, Luis, and Sam stayed for several weeks, their presence more than just protection. They blended into the rhythm of farm life, hauling hay, repairing equipment, and even joking lightly with one another as they worked. To Marcus, their laughter was a reminder of days long gone but not forgotten. At night, they shared quiet conversations, on the porch speaking about their lives since the service, about the challenges of finding peace after years of chaos. "It's strange," Louis said one evening as the crickets sang in the background. "We spent so long fighting to survive. In other countries, who would have thought the real peace would come from fixing fences and feeding chickens?" Sam chuckled softly. "I think we earned it. Maybe this is what we were all looking for, even if we didn't know it." Marcus smiled, listening to his brother's words. He had always believed peace was something you chose, not something given, and now with his friends beside him and his farm safe, that belief felt truer than ever. The gang never returned in full force. On one occasion, a truck passed slowly along the dirt road, its headlights cutting across the fields. But the moment the men inside saw the figures of Marcus and his friends standing calmly on the porch, they pressed the accelerator and disappeared into the distance. It was the last time Marcus ever saw them. The sheriff stopped by a week later, tipping his hat as he leaned against his car. "Haven't seen those fellas around town anymore," he said. "Looks like they finally decided to move on." Marcus only nodded. "Seems that way." The sheriff gave him a knowing look. "Funny how sometimes all it takes is standing your ground. Folks in town are glad you did. You gave them courage, even if they won't say it outright." Marcus didn't reply to that. He wasn't looking for recognition or thanks. He had never wanted to be a hero, not in war and not here. All he wanted was to live quietly, to farm his land in peace. But deep down he felt a quiet pride, not in defeating anyone, but in protecting what mattered without letting anger or chaos rule the moment. As weeks turned into months, the memory of the trouble faded, replaced by the rhythm of farm life. The crops grew tall again, the fences stood firm, and the barn was repaired. Marcus harvested his fields with steady hands, the land yielding to his care. His friends eventually returned to their own homes, but not before making a promise that if ever he needed them again, the call would be enough. "Brothers don't need many words," David said as they packed up the SUV. "You call, we answer, always." Marcus clasped his hand firmly, gratitude shining in his eyes. "And if you ever need me, you know where to find me." The SUV pulled away, dust trailing behind it, and Marcus stood by the gate watching until it disappeared down the Road. The farm was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. The strength of his brothers remained, not in their presence but in the unbreakable bond they shared. The community around him continued to heal. At the diner, people spoke more freely again, their laughter returning. At the supply store, neighbors greeted Marcus with warmer smiles, some even thanking him indirectly by saying things like, "It's good to feel safe again." He never took credit, simply nodding and continuing on with his supplies. But he knew that in their own way they were showing respect. Even children seemed to view him differently. When they passed by on their bikes, they no longer just waved, but sometimes stopped at the fence to ask questions. "Mr. Hill, how do you grow corn so tall?" Or, "Do the chickens know their names?" Marcus answered with patience, smiling at their curiosity. He never told them about his past, never explained why some men had come to his farm in the first place. To them, he was simply the farmer who had made the land strong and welcoming again, and that was enough. At night, when the stars returned to the sky and the world grew still, Marcus sat on his porch as always. The lantern glowed softly beside him, and the dogs lay at his feet. He breathed in the cool air, grateful for the calm. The farm had tested him, just as life always had, but it had also reminded him of what mattered most: loyalty, peace, and the strength to protect without hate. He thought about his journey often. From a soldier on distant battlefields to a farmer on his family's land, the path had not been easy, but it had been worth it. Every hardship, every scar, had led him to this place of quiet purpose. And though trouble had tried to return, it had only proven to him once more that true strength is not loud or violent. True strength is steady, calm, and unshakable. Marcus never spoke much about what happened that season. He didn't write it down or share it with many people, but the community remembered in their own way. They remembered how a man who seemed like just a quiet farmer stood tall when others were afraid. They remembered how trouble faded when he chose not to give in to fear but instead relied on trust, discipline, and the loyalty of his brothers. And Marcus himself remembered the simple truth he had carried all his life: peace is worth protecting. Whether on distant shores or in quiet fields, it is the one treasure greater than all others. As another season passed and the fields turned golden with harvest, Marcus rose each morning with gratitude. His life was not grand, not filled with fame or wealth, but it was rich in the things that mattered most: the soil beneath his feet, the friends he could always count on, the respect of his community, and the knowledge that when tested, he had remained true to himself. The lesson was clear for anyone who looked closely: never underestimate a man who has already endured the hardest storms and still chooses peace. For it is in that choice, not in conflict, that real strength is found.